Hi everyone, if you'll bear with me, I'll just do a slight intro again because we've just started recording the session now. And here we are on the first webinar, which is about the introduction to the relational leadership way. We're going to cover that today before we get on with the other webinars to look at feedback and relational leadership in a much deeper way. So I was just about to start with, why did I get interested in feedback? Well, you'll have your different backgrounds from where you're coming from. Mine was HR, and I was in a large organisation, and so I had plenty of time, evidence, space, opportunity, worries, reflections. What can I do to think about feedback? And so it stayed with me, and the reason it stayed with me on reflection afterwards, because of these areas here, and you will have your own stories, which I will invite to hear. And my main one was about the casualties of feedback, you know, and that worked on both sides, you know, from the point of view of the giver of feedback and the receiver of feedback. We sometimes tend to think that feedback is one way. I want us to think about feedback being two ways. And one story that came to my mind about the giver of feedback was around, you know, those people you sit down and you have a developmental conversation with them, and you think everything's going really well. You think you've explained what's expected in terms of performance, and the person is going, yes, yes, yes. And so you think you've reached agreement at the end of the conversation that they will go away and all these things will happen. And this can happen whether you're a line manager, a leader, or a coach, or a mentor, or a coach supervisor. It can happen, or even in our everyday conversations, our personal relationships. We can have these types of conversations where somebody said, yes, I'll definitely do that. And you know, next time you meet up, nothing's happened. And you think, what happened there? Okay, give everyone the benefit of the doubt, go through the conversation again, and you hope that this time, yes, definitely, I really will. Yeah, you're right. I could have made more effort to get that done by today. And this becomes like a serial pattern. And really, this person appears to be a pleaser, whereas in fact, they're manipulating the giver by saying they agree. This is one reason. There could be several others, of course, but I'm giving you this one reason. By saying they agree and then not doing anything. So that's pretty tricky for the giver of feedback. And then I expect, hi Mira, I expect you've had various stories of where the casualties of receiving feedback, where it hasn't been very kind or it hasn't been very considerate, and people have felt pretty wounded. On a couple of my clips, if you've seen them, I talked about how words can harm our heart more than we know. So those were in my mind about those casualties. And then again, the effectiveness of feedback, you know, given that last example I gave you about where the manager thinks or the leader thinks they've given feedback in a way that's understandable, well, maybe it wasn't. Maybe they didn't check it out well enough. And maybe the person who received it didn't ask enough clarifying questions. Because as you know, when we talk with each other, we can easily make assumptions about what individual people mean by what they're saying. So it's around that effectiveness and taking a bit of time to understand each other. All those lovely skills we know about listening effectively. And lack of focus support, and this is particularly what I saw in organisations where, yeah, they have performance management training and people would go on this training and it would all happen. I remember doing a series of performance management training for an energy company, which is nationwide in the UK. And it was a good solid programme. But again, it's around whether those people on the training course had sufficient scenarios to practice with. It's not enough to do the theoretical input. We need to have some idea about how to manage those tricky situations, what sort of dialogue to use in those. And then, of course, there's the quality of the relationships where they just break down sometimes. Or some people are not interested in being relational. They just want to get on with the job. You know, come to work in the morning, they do their job, they just want to go home at night. So the quality of the relationship has to be of a quality and robustness that feedback will be received well and in a way that's known it's well intended and not seen as a criticism or putting people on the back foot. And I know there's some really good instances of where feedback works and where relationships are robust. But you know, they're already happening, aren't they? So that's not our focus for today. And of course, emotional intelligence and social intelligence are becoming more and more important. The higher up people go in the organisation, the more important it becomes. The technical skills are not so important because there's other people that can fulfill those. And I'm thinking particularly as well at the moment about when most of us are working remotely, and it's maybe more difficult for some than others to get that same relational experience online rather than being in person. We can't see the whole person. I can just see parts of you today. Some of you I've met before, some of you I know pretty well. And so I have a level of relationship, but some of you I've just met for the first time today. So we're trying to create some rapport, some communication between us. And this is for a learning experience. So imagine how much harder we have to work when it's online and we don't have that same connection. And also when we don't understand maybe the well-being of that person, the mental health. So there's lots more to consider, especially if we want to give feedback. How do we manage performance with remote working? It's an extra skill. So hoping again from our brief entry into the relational leadership way today, that you will go away with some ideas and some thoughts that you can think about. You can either pass it on to your clients, use it yourself, or think about, yeah, there's extra considerations beyond what we would do person to person. And of course, the other reason I was interested was I was just curious. I was really curious about seeing if I could find out if there was something that could be done that would make feedback get a better press, basically, and would help people be more positive about it. So, slides are stuck. So we've got the slides, that's the start, isn't it? Let me see if I can do it another way. There we go. Phew, we have to try different ways, don't we, with technology? If the first way doesn't work, we've got to try the second. So what I'd like to hear from you now, because as I say, I don't want this to be just about me talking with you. What's your experience of feedback? Can you give some examples of maybe some positive things that we can learn from, and maybe not so positive? You know, how did those make you feel, the positive ones and the not so positive? And how would you describe the quality of the relationship that you had, both in the positive and the not so positive? So it's over to you to hear your examples, and please don't be shy because I'm really interested in hearing from you.
I can start, Lise, if you want.
Thank you.
And I'll start with a negative one, just because it's quite recent, and then I'll think of a positive. But just with a supplier of mine in one of my businesses, it's a very hierarchical organization. It's an Italian company, which nothing to do with being Italian, but there is a certain way of working in Italy, and patriarchal is the word I'm looking for.
Okay.
So everything comes from the top down, and it's always one way. So the feedback that you get sometimes tend to be more finger pointing than feedback about what you did. To the point that after 7 or 8 years relationship with them, after the last phone call where the feedback wasn't so much a feedback, but was a finger wagging exercise from their side, I decided that that was the end of our relationship, that I didn't need any more of the finger wagging. So, and through my coaching business, I've learned that, you know, to actually have a conversation. So if we have had a conversation about that particular point, if we have had a two-way conversation, we would probably still doing business at this stage.
Yeah.
But from my point of, from the recipient of that feedback, I just it was just the last straw.
Yeah. And you see, Andrea, that's a loss for both, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's a loss for you in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, leaving a client, and it's a loss for them to lose a valuable resource. And just think how much that's multiplied when you're actually employed in a company. All those recruitment costs and then re-advertising for someone new, just for the sake of engaging in a relationship conversation. Yeah.
Just to give you
Thank
the
you.
positive side of it very quickly. So
Yes, please.
a couple of weeks later, having taken that burden off my shoulder, because it was a burden, and with another company I deal with in Spain, and with everything that's going on at the moment, there's a lot of negativity, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, that's the reality. I sent him an email and I said, look, let's have a meeting and let's inject some positivity into all this and see what we can come up with. And it did. You know, we'll grieved through the problems because it's a grieving process at the moment, and we find ways forward. You know, it's still bleak because the reality is bleak, but at the same time we're all in a much more positive. So there was a feedback from my side and the feedback from their side. There were problems, there were issues, there was a solution, and we're moving on, and we're having a second call this afternoon to move on further. So that's the two sides of the same coin.
Excellent, well done. And you can see the difference, can't you, between the two conversations very clearly, very well explained, Andrea. In terms of the second one, the second one was much more relational, wasn't it? You had an opportunity to have a conversation with another person about the current situation. Thank you. Thanks for getting us started.
No.
What about some other stories?
I can do one.
Thank you.
So the negative comes to mind more readily than the positive, I find. Probably the worst feedback experience I had personally was from the coach of my former boss. And she started giving me feedback without, it was an open space, without any warning that she was going to give me feedback. And just started talking, and I was thinking, is she giving me feedback? And she started making assumptions about what profile I was and on Fire OP. So I just found it so disrespectful. I was really in shock, actually, because of the way it was done. So you talk in your book about picking the time, you know, getting people in the frame of mind to receive, and it just wasn't. So that's a very clear example of something that was not done well. And I know that she'd revealed to me previously that she felt a bit threatened by me, and that I made her feel you know, anxious about her own abilities, which was an odd thing for me. So there was obviously something in the relationship that she was finding very difficult. I wonder how that played into it. So that would be my negative one.
Wow. And there's lots of the complexity going on there, Jane, isn't there? Thank you for sharing that one. I mean, as you say, the shock of somebody just coming out with heavy feedback like that, very personal feedback as well, without any permission. You know, there's something about having some engagement before you start going down that direction, especially in an organizational setting. We tend not to do it so much in a personal one, even though I think we ought to as well. But to just launch in like that, I can imagine you were stunned.
Absolutely, yeah.
And really, she was talking about her stuff by what you're saying.
There that was somehow co-created by us at the beginning of our relationship, where I thought I was being really, you know, respectful and supportive, and really not. So there's a whole, you know, raft of things that might have been going on, but she obviously felt something. The very quick positive one I can give. It was more difficult to think of these, but it was when I had a very positive relationship with my boss, and I knew that she was very supportive of me generally, and she gave me some feedback And the way she did it was really empathic, because she also talked about her own struggle with the same challenge.
Right.
It was, like I can share with you, it was perfectionism. And she said, look, Jane, you know, this is what I'm seeing. You know, I also have those tendencies. And I just felt really that she was with me, and she wanted to be supportive and helpful rather than attacking. So that would be my positive one, which I think feeds into that relationship piece as well, that, you know, we had that as a really strong basis.
Excellent. And, you know, there is a real art and skill in how much to disclose about ourselves. Let's just talk about business relationships. In business relationships, because sometimes too much disclosure doesn't have the desired effect, and nor is it always a good idea to have too much disclosure. But in this instance, it sounds just the right amount, you know, that someone is empathizing with you. And I'll talk a little bit about compassion later on, and empathy, but more in future videos about that, future webinars about that. So thank you. Yeah, and that's a great example, isn't it, where somebody meets you again with respect and relationally, and a great example of relational leadership. If I can just go back briefly to the negative one, and just to say, as a kind of wrap up to that one, of course, we can't make assumptions about that person either. You know, clearly we don't want to replicate what she seemed to be doing in the scenario you kindly shared with us, but we don't know her motives either, do we? Until we are able to have that conversation. Wouldn't it have been great if you could have had that and were able to kind of gone further into it and kind of unpicked some of the issues that were driving her to be like that?
Absolutely.
Have accepted it. Yeah,
it's a great point. Yeah, we don't know. She might have thought she was giving me a gift, you know.
She may well have done. Yeah, as I say, we can't assume ourselves, and that's the next step, if you like, especially when we get feedback that takes us by surprise, because often we just walk away from it because it's such a shock, and we think, I don't believe I just heard that. But if we can take that moment, that reflective deep breath, and just think, what's going on here? You know, if we see others as positive people and thinking the best about people until we know otherwise, then we can maybe open that conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to think I would react differently now. This was several years ago, but
yeah,
you know, who knows? We're all human, and
exactly, exactly, Jane. We're all human, so we can't predict whether we would behave differently or not. Catches us in the moment, doesn't it? But if we can kind of build that muscle and think, whoa, just a moment, let's take a deep breath. It's really worth the trouble.
Yeah.
So thank you. Lovely examples so far. Anyone else?
Lise? It's Rachel. Shall I?
Thanks, Rachel. I'm looking at the camera, so I can only see you if I look down at my laptop. So I'm actually just looking at a camera. Okay, so we've got eye contact.
Yeah, I'm Rachel. A lot of the work that I do is related to health care contexts, working with staff, but also working with members of the public in coaching contexts. And my passion is around building collaborative relationships and collaborative practices. So I was really interested in your work around relational leadership and the relational way in a broad context. And I guess in a sense, what your conversations and reflections were prompting me to think about is that context of where there's a real engagement and encouragement for people to work in a collaborative way, for people to engage with members of staff and with the public, and how that is reflected in terms of everyday practice, where if you were to look at the national press, you will notice that clearly that's not necessarily how it feels.
Yes.
And so I think some of the approaches that you're sharing in terms of the relational way is really appropriate to not only in coaching and mentoring context, but actually thinking about how that relates to having those really good relationships, to share and build those kinds of much more collaborative and engaging ways of working and being.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that reminder, Rachel, because interestingly, I ran a similar webinar for our local CIPD group here in Gloucestershire a little while back. And there was somebody from NHS on that call, and they said, you know, having looked at the relational leadership way, it just was a bit of an aha moment, was the word they used when they came back, because they hadn't thought of it as the relationship being so important.
No,
and what we do.
I'm currently trying to finish my own doctoral studies, so I've been looking at it quite closely. But what is striking is lots of the kind of policies and practices are very much focused on theories and processes to make this change, rather than really focusing on the relationship, and particularly the relationship beyond the clinical relationship. So thinking about those wider interactions and how you build that, where it may be a relationship between a chief executive or a senior leader with a member of the public who might be contributing to shaping the quality of that service. So some really interesting correlations, I think. So apologies, I've deviated a little bit from just the good example and the bad example.
No, not at all.
For me, the sort of the contrast between an environment which is thinking very much on process and theory to make that change, compared to something which is thinking much more about the relationship. You talked about social intelligence, thinking about not just being verbally creating in those spaces, but how we can use more creative and visual ways to help people make meaning, both in feedback and beyond that, feels really helpful and important.
Yeah. Good, because as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it, because, you know, with my background, I trained in all sorts of psychometrics, for example, and they are a really good tool. You know, I've got a chapter in the book on tools and techniques that are used primarily in conversations about feedback. And I'm sorry, they don't work if the relationship isn't working, because they can be as robust and have all the underlying statistical data that's giving them reliability and validity. But if the relationship isn't robust, they're not going to be robust, even though they're a good discussion tool. Yeah. So thank you for the reminder, Rachel. So unless anyone's got a burning story they want to share with us all, I'm going to move on, because I do want to show you the relational leadership way, because it is a primer for what comes next in the other webinars. So if there is something you really want to share, please let me know now. Let us know now and share it, or please write afterwards and just share that story. I'd love to hear from you. Okay. So I'll give you a second just in case someone wants to speak. That's probably 5 seconds. Okay, so let's move on. So in my view, the relational leadership way is a way of being, the way that we are as a human being. And you might say, well, yeah, what is that? Well, it is just about being a human being, understanding that you're talking to another human being who has the same aspirations as you do, has the same energies as you do, up and down, has the same desires as you do, has the same upsets as you do. We'll cry the same way as you do. We'll laugh the same way as you do. So we all do the same things because we're all wired in the same way. Okay, there's differences between us all, and that's where the complexity comes in relationships. But the foundation, if you like, of being a human being, under our skin, we're all the same, okay? But we have to work with that complexity. And we have to make our way of being as positive as we possibly can, accepting we have our own human frailties and forgiving ourselves for those, just as we want to be positive about understanding others. This is just about understanding things from another person's point of view. I've done a couple of talks on difficult conversations, and I've always ended it with, there's no such thing as a difficult conversation if we both make the effort, it takes two, to understand where each other's coming from. That's what we're talking about in relational leadership. We also need to have that way of being, to have also a trusting culture to operate in. If our culture is kind of one of those where some will label it toxic and others will say there's no such thing as a toxic culture, it's the people inside of it. Of course it is. An organisation is just bricks and mortar. It's the people that make the culture. Yeah, it could be the top leadership creates a certain type of culture, which makes it very hard for people in the rest of the organisation to be open and say what they would like to be different. So you get a subculture going on, you'll get several subcultures going on, and that's where things start to go wrong. And that's where there's a mismatch and disengagement from the organisation. The psychological contract is lost because there's not that understanding that we're all here for a purpose. A strategic plan is set for the direction of the organisation. Well, sorry, it doesn't happen on its own, does it? I know I'm stating the obvious, but we often forget that. A strategic plan, a strategic direction will only happen with the people that are there. Okay, you need all the other infrastructure, you need, machinery or whatever you have in your organisation as well. But you can have the best, again, best equipment, etc. But people won't make it work most effectively if they don't feel appreciated and recognised and respected. So this is where I'm coming from. This is what we want to be working towards in terms of a way of being. We want to be also working in that type of culture and encouraging it. So here we are. Here's the composite relational leadership way. And the research that I did, as you can imagine, a lot of data from observations in practice and a thematic analysis came up with probably about 20 themes, of which we are aware of, we know what they are, but we haven't looked at them in this combination. And my thinking was to make it portable and transferable into people's practice or into organisation or into trainings or however we're going to use it. And, I would use it as well into, developing teams. All sorts of ways it can be used. It's very portable. I put it into 3 parts. Now, although it's in 3 parts, I would still like you to see it as this composite. But I'm going to go through each part just so that we can look at each one in a bit more detail. So part 1 of the relational leadership way is what you need to encourage relationships, what you need to prepare, the key word is prepare, to encourage relationships that stimulate constructive conversations. Now the you there actually means both of us. So, it's no good one person being really prepared and the other person isn't bothering, right? By the way, I'm very happy to be interrupted if you've got questions along the way. We'll have hopefully a bit of time at the end to have some Q&A, but if you've got a comment or something, please just interrupt. I'm very, very comfortable with that. So if we're both thinking about, and I'm talking now about a more formal feedback conversation, obviously those kind of coffee machine feedback conversations still can have in mind about some of these elements that you're going to see today here in the relational leadership way. But it's really critical that you do preparation if you're in a formal performance management conversation. And the first thing we need to think about is ourselves, both of us individuals. We are going through tough times at the moment. We may be stressed, not just with our normal workloads, but with the context in which we're operating, the insecurity of not knowing where we're going with COVID, the insecurity of our life on this earth. There's a lot for us to deal with at the moment as human beings. So if we're going to go in and have a meaningful conversation with somebody else, we need to be mindful about how we're feeling. Have we just raced from a busy meeting? Are we worried about a lot of things that are interfering with our ability to be there with that other person and to be really focused on that other person? As I say, it goes both ways. Also, I said I'd mention compassionate. How compassionate are we feeling for ourselves if we've got to give difficult feedback? And how compassionate are we feeling for the other person about how they might receive it? And of course, we mentioned assumptions today. We can't assume that somebody else will receive the feedback in the way that we might receive the same feedback. They could have the opposite, it could have the opposite impact on them than it does on us. So we've got to think about those things. Is this going to be well received, or is there going to be some possibility of some damage in the relationship that I need to be mindful of? Yeah. Okay, that's the first thing on self-management. So we also need to be confident about it. Are we going to go in there and say, you know, the feedback that I'm going to give, I feel confident it's in the interests of the other person. It's not just all about me, about how I feel. It's about what's best for both of us. What's best for the organisation, what's best for the team. So we have to think about that wider system and not just immediately what's bothering us. So again, it's about soul searching, it's about reflecting on ourselves, it's about holding that mirror up to ourselves. Where are we coming from with this feedback? And then the readiness for feedback. So having thought that through, how ready do we think the other person will be? How much do we know about them? Excuse me a second, I just need a small drink. Thank you. How much do we know about them? If it's a line manager and a direct report, how much have I connected with that person? Do I know even just a kind of small piece about who they are, what their likes and dislikes are? Or have I just completely looked at it from the task role? I haven't thought about the person behind the task. So therefore, I won't really know about the readiness for feedback. Those of us that work in relational ways, and I'm guessing that all of us on this call today do, we will have thought more about that. But if we're going to apply this universally, we need to be mindful of people that haven't had the type of training and reflective practice that most of us have had here today. So that's part one, about getting that preparation there and thinking about that impact that the feedback might have on the other person, might have on us, sharing it. So that's part one. Part two of the relational leadership way is actively engaging. So these are areas that we want to be proactive about. So again, we can co-create conversations with the other person and together that are learning conversations. They're positive. They're conversations that we find interesting, that gives us a curiosity, that we want to go deeper about, that we want to have more conversations about, that actually enliven us and motivate us. Now, the third thing that came out of the research was objectivity. Now, we know we can't be totally objective as human beings. We all have a level of subjectivity, but at least if we're aware that we have a subjective element to us, then we're part of the way there in ensuring we're being as objective as we can. You know, we hear lots in all the research material about giving feedback, saying, got to get evidence, you know, do it in that moment, just after it. All of that is very true, but remember where you're getting the evidence from. In every piece of evidence like that, unless it's a measurement of something that's not a human being, that's something that's non-human, then you can probably get positive, what's the word I'm looking for? You can get feedback from that tells you whether it's right or wrong or whether it's working. But when we're talking about someone's perception of how someone's performing, that's going to be subjective in each individual, because we're all coming at it with our worldview, with all our baggage from the past that we bring with us. So we've got to be pretty mindful. How am I influencing what I'm about to say? So we have to be careful about the words that we use when we're sharing what we believe is our world, what we believe is the truth and reality, which is actually only our worldview. It may not be the same as somebody else's reality. Mindfulness there is about encouraging us to be mindful and practice that in terms of focusing, being able to concentrate fully on when we're in a conversation. Because as we know, we can easily get distracted by all sorts of things. Sounds outside. I just had somebody in the next apartment to where I am just close a door. I couldn't help hearing that, but I have to keep focused on my call today, focused on all of you, not be distracted and think, I wonder who that was. Yeah, so I've got to keep contained. And having that mindfulness training, and many of us may have already been through it, helps us to be present. And we're talking here about fully presence. It's easy to say, oh yeah, I know, I'm there with you. Right, I'm in this room, I'm looking at you, I've got eye contact, so therefore I'm present. That doesn't give you the passport to presence because you're just getting eye contact with somebody. As you well know, I'm sure you're aware of a lot of this in terms of the challenge and the level of concentration that you have to be totally present with somebody else. And I hope you appreciate, I'm just giving you glimpses of each of these themes, just so that you get an idea and an overview of it. More comes later in the other webinars. Timing of feedback's critical. Okay, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could predict the perfect time when it's the moment to give that feedback that we want to give? We're never going to be able to do that, I don't think. But if we operate in a way of being that I'm talking about in the relational leadership way, then we're going to get closer to it than maybe just some ad hoc guess. Okay, so let's go on to the part 3, and that's you both. So again, both of us noticing and reacting to what emerges and impacts in sustaining the quality of that relationship. So we know we've done our preparation, we're actively taking steps to be relational, and now we're also reacting to what's emerging in the conversation between us. And the themes here are around physicality. What are we noticing somatically in the other person? What are we noticing about their level of energy? When they share conversation with us, are they moving down? Are they getting all excited and animated? What's going on with them? What's their physiology that's going to give you some messages? What are you noticing kinesthetically with them? And then the emotional state. What's our own emotional state? Okay, we might be able to predict the other person's emotional state, but if we check it out. But what's also our own emotional state? How are we feeling? Are we picking up the feelings of the other person? Is it right to have that moment of disclosure and to say, do you know what, I'm feeling really sad at the moment, and I don't know whether that's how you're feeling right now. Is it the right moment to have that conversation? And to use our intuition, tap into our unconscious and our subconscious. Let those thoughts rise. If we're fully present, they will. If we're not having any distractions, we will get messages from our intuition. Again, we need to check it out. We know this stuff. We need to check it out. But at least it's giving us information there. Yeah. Okay, and then the metaphysical one is the last theme. And this, to me, was like the most exciting one in a way, because it was like a little teaser, around when I was drilling down with interviews with the study participants and saying, well, how did you know the time was right for feedback? Well, I just knew. And it was very hard to articulate it. If you've ever seen the work of Minns and Cooper on relational depth, and I'm hoping to be doing some work with them on relational leadership, then you start to get an idea of where I'm coming from. And that is, when you're on that edge of learning, you kind of have that moment where there's total engagement with each other, and you get a sense of what's around you in the field, and it's just kind of magical. And if you've experienced those moments, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But I'm researching metaphysical more fully, because there doesn't seem to be too much out there anyway. It's an area that we all need to tap into as human beings to get some messages from. So yeah, anyway, those are the 10 themes. And then just to kind of wrap up on the relational leadership way, introducing it to you today, if we look at it and we think, yeah, actually, I'm okay with a couple of those themes. I know what it's like to think about emotional states. I do prep for my feedback conversations, but you know, I'd like to just think about a bit more about how objective I am. So focus in on a specific theme that works for you to enrich your practice and enrich your way of being. And then there might be a combination of themes. You might think, oh yeah, I think I'll just look at that part too and see what I could activate in my conversations. But best of all is to focus on the whole framework, because the whole framework is about relational leadership. It is about that total way of being, okay, where we're working with consensus together in a learning partnership. We're both equal. There's no power over, there's power with and power for, and there's no constraint. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we all could have those open conversations? So there you are. That's some insights into the relational leadership way. And I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment because I'd like to come back to you. So are you still seeing the relational leadership way slide? Or are you seeing each other now?
No, we are all together.
Good. Thank you, Vlad.
The only thing that happened, it was that we didn't have a slideshow.
Oh, no.
Yes.
You're joking.
No, don't worry.
I wish you'd stop me because, as I
No,
said to you earlier,
you speak.
Was it okay?
So engaged that it makes no sense to.
Okay, thank you. Because we suddenly thought it was working, didn't we, at the beginning? And then it wasn't. What are you seeing now on the screen? Just everyone together still?
Yes.
It's been the same way the whole time? Okay. Well, I will share the slides with you, all right? So
Great.
that you can see them. That's the best way, I think, around that. Don't you just love technology? Anyway, I'm not going to go on about that. You may have some questions.
I have one question, Liz, on the objectivity. Yeah, just I'm a bit unclear on that, what you meant about objectivity in that particular case. You mentioned the importance of feedback, the conversation that matters, and then you talked about objectivity. Can you explain a little bit more, please?
Yes, I mean, the word itself, objectivity, is where we want to be totally right about something. Something we're going to say is the absolute truth. There's an absolution around it. But we know that doesn't exist. And I've got into trouble with many researchers who look at the more positive approach, the more scientific approach to research, and look for hypotheses to test, and then find the data to either prove or disprove that. Whereas you can't work with human beings in that same positivity way, because we are human beings. It's impossible to measure the complexity of being a human being. So we have to allow ourselves some element of flexibility in terms of what our worldview is. I don't know if you've ever seen the work of Ernesto Spinelli on existentialism. He talks about, you know, I could hold up, what can I hold up? I can hold up this mug, yeah? Now, I'm seeing the handle on this side, aren't I? But you're seeing it on the opposite side to me, I'm guessing. Yeah, but that's your reality. My reality is this, you know, if I turned it around like that, we're going to get a different shape all the time. And this is kind of how he explains. I remember when I went to see him, he held up a chair and he was talking about, you might think this is a chair, but it's a piece of, it's wood, it's, you know, constructed of architecture, and, you know, there's various ways of explaining it. So why I'm giving those examples is to really get us to think about, don't be so certain that you know the truth. Now, we can't possibly stop every single time and think, oh, I better check this out, because we would just be paralyzed as human beings. And that is where that fight and flight came from, that we know about, that when we have that reaction to an occurrence, our body gets on red alert and that adrenaline goes and everything rushes to protecting ourselves because we feel we're in danger. Okay, now we still have that reflex within us, but we don't necessarily need it in the way we did when we were hardwired for it all those generations and generations ago when we were in physical fear of ourselves, but we still have that hardwiring. So we have to be careful that what we see as a danger point is actually as we see it. Is that the truth? Well, of course, you could argue that the other person's reality isn't the truth either. So the best that we can do is to gain an understanding of why somebody is behaving the way they are. What's their drivers? What's their motivations? So that's what's behind the relational leadership way and a way of being. It's much deeper than that as well, Andrea. It goes a lot further, but that's a kind of quick snapshot answer. I don't know how much that helps you.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? We've got a few minutes left. I've just noticed in the chat, thank you for letting me know the slides weren't showing, but I was so engrossed with looking at the camera, so I'd got eye contact with you that I missed the chat. So if you don't have any questions, what are your thoughts on what you've seen today?
Something that
go on.
I observe lately, and maybe it's only in my bubble, and I would like to see if you see things the same. There is a tendency to not want to get feedback. So, in my opinion, based on what you said, it's true that the moment is important, but also I think it's very important the person who will receive feedback to want to receive the feedback. And yeah, indeed, we can define the relationship based on many things, but if we think at it like based on trust and mutual regard, then we have the basis for the feedback. But also, if there is a relationship, if the person is not ready or don't want the feedback, then it's useless to give them feedback. And I've seen this in many situations, that people actually, they don't want to get any feedback.
Yeah, it's a very good point you make, Vlad. And that was that in the part one about the readiness for feedback. That's in the preparation stage. How much do you know about that person's readiness for feedback? And if you think that they just won't want to know, of course, that's an assumption on our part that they don't want to know. So maybe there's something about taking the risk, you know, around, if we keep in mind that we are going to be respectful and we're going to use language and tone is really important here, around, you know, the words that we choose to open that conversation. And if it's something if it's something, I don't know what example you have, but if I just give a couple of examples, if it's something personal, in a personal relationship, or a good friend, I think, you know, to open it up with, there's something that's been bothering me and I'd really like to share it with you. You know, if the tone's right, the words are right, whatever words that you think that person would be willing to at least listen to you, listen to what you say. Avoid using the word feedback. We don't have to use that word. In fact, I think it's the worst phrase on earth to use.
True.
Can I give you some feedback? So delete that from all of your conversations. Yeah. As Andrea said, that says feedback in itself. And remember, every interaction we have with each other is feedback. Yeah. Even if it's not verbal, we're getting feedback from each other. We're picking up signals. So I would open the conversation, but don't expect an answer. I think this is where it breaks down sometimes. If a person's not ready for feedback, then think about yourself in that circumstance. If somebody says to you that you feel, I'm not happy about this, you need time. You may not want to hear it. You may be resistant to it. You need time to think about it. So I think you have to give feedback and then let it go until we've got another time where we can go back and have another conversation about it. So don't expect to get readiness feedback. But if we're in an organisational point of view, sorry, but performance conversations are part of being at work, you know. But again, we've got to be going into that performance conversation in a way that's humane. Yeah, in a way that's treating the other person as a human being, not a number on the payroll. Or a resource. I mean, even the word human resources, you know, I always think about it. Are you just a number? Are you just a number on the payroll slip? So that's what I would say to that, Vlad. I know it's deeper than that, and it would be good to have some examples and really unpick those and say, well, what would we do in these? I'm hoping that we get to that point where we can bring some real case studies and discuss those further. I'm mindful that we've only got a few minutes to go, so I want to take any last minute questions.
So what's running through my head is the situations where perhaps the giver of the feedback, you know, may not have positive intent, and may be somebody that, as the recipient, you know, perhaps has got an ulterior political agenda, or is not, not giving feedback for the purpose of your own benefit. The way we've been talking today kind of assumes that all feedback is valuable and all is a gift, and as recipients we always need to listen. So just curious about whether you do think that that's the case, even in those kind of extreme situations where, you know, like someone was referring to earlier, they're almost being attacked with things that the receiver knows are not true, not just.
Yeah, I think those sorts of conversations are really even more prone, that's not the right word, that's not the word I want, but it's even more important in those conversations to say what your truth is without expecting somebody else to accept that as your truth. And if you feel that what's being said to you, whatever you're feeling about that, I think it does take courage. I'm not saying it's easy. It does take courage, but I think there is something about bringing that out into the open and saying, I don't know what your intention is, but what you're saying to me, this is how it's making me feel. Or this is how it sounds to me. That's all. That's still being respectful, but it is giving a very powerful message to that other person that you're picking up something from them, because you obviously are, to have even brought that message now, Jane. You've obviously either observed that or experienced it. So you clearly picked up those messages, yeah?
Well, we all know it's not always, you know. And I think you said in your book earlier on, I was really interested, you said something about, well, actually, it's important that as the recipient of feedback, you get to choose, you know, if you're doing a 360, for example, who's going to give you feedback, because it might not be the best thing for somebody else to say, look, you've got to get feedback from this slew of people, some of whom may, you know, I don't know, not be people whose feedback you want.
Yes.
It's a really tricky area, but I love what you say about that, to say actually it's about what we do, you know, as the recipients, for ourselves, and that's all we can do. And that, I suppose, relates to your third part around really using in that relationship, you know, really being aware of your own feelings, but also expressing them. And I guess, you know, there's a chance that could actually have a positive impact, right? We don't know. So
Exactly.
I love that actually as a response.
Thank you. And you know, and I would like, as I say, to get further down the line, beyond webinars, where we could maybe have workshops where we talk through these actual case studies, and we bring them. We've all got material that we want answers to. I mean, as you know, I'm already starting on a second book with bringing some case studies into that, but to actually have physical workshops where we can test them out and see what the possible scenarios could be, that's where the richness comes in. I'm already running masterclasses on coaching dilemmas, which isn't used in the relational leadership way, and they work really well. So I'm very positive about implementing the relational leadership way into it to give another dimension. So thank you for that, Jane. That's a really, really powerful question, and we like the tricky ones. The easy ones are okay. Okay, so I'm going to turn the recording off now,